Good evening. Thank you for joining us about a discussion about emergency medical services in Wapello County. I'm Gayla Harrison. I'm an attorney here in town, and Tim asked me to kind of moderate and help out in this discussion this evening. I come to this with a little bit of background. My husband was both in volunteer fire and ambulance work. He was just an EMT, no paramedic there. But I occasionally found myself at scenes with him and got to hear a lot about calls that were made for emergency medical services. So we've got a little bit of background to talk about today. We're going to talk about emergency medical services through kind of a healthcare SBAR method, which is what's the current situation involving emergency medical services here in Wapello County. Then we'll go into background, and it's actually quite interesting. And we'll talk about where the ambulance service has been in Wapello County over the years. Then an assessment, talk about what the problem is, and then ultimately kind of the process that is in place to try and determine a future for emergency medical services here in Wapello County. There are going to be a number of speakers, so I'll just briefly introduce each of them now, and then we'll call them up at the appropriate time. Tim Richmond, the director of Wapello County Emergency Management Agency, is going to be talking about the situation and the assessment. We've got lots of speakers to talk about history. First is Bill Reese is going to give us kind of the funeral director involvement in an ambulance service, followed by Rich Gomer, who was involved in some of the early hospital years of involvement with ambulance service. And Rich comes with a lot of different experiences in the community as a retired attorney and serving on a number of different boards. Then we have Cindy Hewitt, who worked with Ormix for I don't know how many years, but as many I recall. So she brings a history kind of in the late 20th century. And then we've got Mark Frymeyer, the current head of the Ottumwa Regional Ambulance Service. And then we'll finish off with Brian Ziegler, one of our board supervisors, who's going to talk about the recommendation part, the what happens after tonight discussion. So with that, we just want to talk a little bit about what emergency medical services are, and it's a system. And there are a lot of different components to that system, but the goal is to make sure that we can transport those urgent medical care needs and also transport people who are seriously ill or injured to other medical systems if we need to do that. We need to be able to respond quickly to emergencies and provide life-saving care, and then again, transport if necessary to take care of those people. And as you look down at the package of services that's on this model, it has not only the communication part, but the ambulance service, the interfacility transfers, medical response, air ambulances. We're not talking about that in Wapello County. Other people will provide that. Disaster medicine. So there's just a lot of different components to it. So with that, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Tim Richmond, who can give us kind of a current assessment of the situation.
Thank you, Gayla. To start with, what most folks are startled sometimes to understand is that EMS is not required by Iowa law. And sometimes people don't believe us when we say that, but there absolutely is no legal requirement for an ambulance to show up to respond to your 911 call. And so that's one of the reasons we're having this conversation. We've come to expect it because we delivered those services as community members for a long time. And you'll learn in the historical part of the conversation tonight about how that came to be and all the hard work that went into providing the service we now enjoy and frankly expect today. So we've come to expect it, we've come to rely on it, but we have to pay for it, and that's the ultimate reason we're having this conversation. So I want to talk about three things: the service providers and families and communities. So first, let's talk about the people that do this work. And there's a lot of people, it's more than just, as Mark will attest, the ambulance showing up. There are several levels of service providers. First is our non-transport services that exist in every community in our county. And you see them listed there. Agency Fire and Rescue, Eldon Fire and Rescue, here in Atumwa, Fire and Rescue, Wapello County will all provide non-transport. In the northeast part of our county comes out of our neighboring community, Hedrick. They have a QRS team. And in addition to that, we have a fire department only service in Eddyville that will come out and help you with the worst case scenarios, so cardiac care and severe trauma. We train those folks, even if they're not EMS, they can do defibrillator and stop the bleed. Our law enforcement partners have provided service for quite some time. We sometimes forget that they all carry AEDs in their vehicles, and maybe will respond and help out in that cardiac event, to that severe car accident, severe trauma, farm accident. They're there too. And then, of course, our transport services, Blakesburg Fire and Rescue, that has been around for quite some time now, and of course, the Tunnel Regional Mobile Intensive Care Services, WARMIX, has been here since 1981. So in those non-transport services, one of the issues is they're a fire base. And the fire tax, the fire levy that came about in the early 70s when fire protection was mandated in Iowa, says that they may provide emergency medical services, but doesn't provide a separate funding source for it. So they have to pull it from their existing funding that's supposed to provide fire protection. So I can tell you that funding's not adequate either. So we're trying to do more with less, and we all know that's not possible. And I could go on another tangent about the fire service and how they've grown over the years, and they do so much more than what they did started in the 70s. They provide specialty rescues, extrication, all these extra things in EMS. So we're trying to pay for it with the same money. The transport service is really dealing with the fact that, I mean, we all know that we're in the poverty belt of Iowa in the bottom two tiers of counties, and we have a lot of our friends and neighbors and customers of the service that rely on government programs like Medicare and Medicaid. We've heard that talked about a lot in the news lately, and you'll see a graphic later that shows you that 78% of those calls are funded in that way, and that's not adequate funding. So it really comes down to this: what is it we need to do for our families? That's what it's all about. We have to take care of each other. We have to take care of our families, and they need and expect guaranteed service, and we need to provide that for them as part of their healthcare options. So how do we do that? Well, our communities need to be able to have a contract with those services that say, okay, what are our assurances? We've gotten by for a very long time on strong gentlemen's agreements, unwritten agreements, just a lot of dedicated people doing this because it's the right thing to do. But we're getting to an era where it's harder and harder to fill those schedules with volunteer labor because they have other things pulling on their demands of their families. So the desire is still out there, but the schedule is the problem. So we need to fill those ranks with paid full-time folks and let the volunteers continue to operate and supplement it, but we have to provide some assurances and guarantees. So with the contract comes measurable outcomes and accountability. And I'll talk about how we do that. So there has been some history in the community of subsidizing that service with public funding. We'll talk about that in the history, but 86 is when that ended, and it came from the federal government. So our ultimate goal is to ensure that we have a community system that serves our families and our communities and that meets our needs in a sustainable and reliable method. You've heard me talk in presentations with the board of supervisors over the last 4 months about a metric called the system standards. And that was created in 2010 by the Iowa Department of Public Health. It's a rubric that gives us as EMS providers and services some ideals to shoot for. And they're really our best practices. And here's the data points. And we'll get into that a little bit later when I talk about some gaps in each of those. This is the scoring rubric that we need to judge ourselves on and report about ourselves on to our families and our communities. So Iowa 422D is really the source of the start of this conversation. Originally introduced it in the summer of 23, and we talked about it then at the county level, and we talked with local officials and decided that, yes, we want to do it, but there were some other things we had to get taken care of first. And so there were some other initiatives that happened. And then at the beginning of this year, the board of supervisors said, you know what, we need to revisit that. Let's start the conversation again. And so the work began in January. So the real goal of 422D, or what 422D does, is allow counties to say, this is an essential service we want to make sure we guarantee for our citizens. And there's a process we go about doing that. And Brian will cover that at the end. But it does essentially two things. It establishes an advisory council that's going to figure out how this looks for us for the future. And it gives them the option to ask the taxpayers for a levy support.
All right, so as we transition from speaker to speaker, Bill, you can get your on your way up here. How many of you have ever made a 911 call? Anybody? And were you satisfied with the quickness of the response of that 911 call? Did you get what you needed? My experience has been pretty good with 911 calls, and there's separate funding for that. So we're gonna go to Bill, who will start us out with kind of the ambulance service in Wapello County that started with funeral directors.
Well, partially. Thank you, Galen. Sounds good. Thank you. I'll give you a little bit of the history, very unrelated to what things are today, but my great-grandfather, Carol, he started Reese Funeral Home back in 1929, but he started working in funeral service for his uncle, Charles Sullivan, back in the early 1900s. And Uncle Charlie had a funeral home on West 2nd Street, which is where the Washington Street parking lot is today, just across the old YWCA or the hub. And at that time, they provided funeral service, but also ambulance service to those that required it or requested. Very different than what you'd expect in some ways. There was emergency service, but what they provided was more for those who did not want the emergency part of the service, wanted to be transported. They transported to the hospital or to Iowa City or different places. And back in 1915 was the first ambulance that Uncle Charlie purchased. And there at the bottom on the right was an announcement that we had in our files when he shared that, put in the paper. The picture there at the top right is of him next to that ambulance that was purchased. It was the first automobile ambulance in Wapello County. Prior to that, they did have horse-drawn ambulances, and the horse-drawn ambulance, I think, started back in New York in the late 1800s. Most of that time only provided very simple services beyond transportation, possibly very limited, of just a cot with him from in the house to the ambulance and when they got to the hospital. But as you see moving through the years, there were different advertisements, and funeral homes were not only advertised funeral service, but ambulance care as well. So if someone wanted ambulance service, they would call the funeral home they wanted, not the 911 where it went to a general number, but very much specific to the place where they were looking. You can see some of the older numbers, 103, 127, goes back quite a ways before the numbers you see today. And throughout the years, the funeral homes all provided ambulance service just as a continual another service to the families that they took care of through the funeral business as well. And as they moved through the years, there were 6 funeral homes at one time providing ambulance service throughout Wapello County. But as they got to the 1970s, they were becoming outdated. And there were 4 funeral homes in 1973 that came together and said that we no longer want to provide ambulance service here in Wapello County. We're ready to move this over and step away. And at that time, all 4 funeral homes were charging $12 for a trip. They had come together in price fixing, so somewhat, and set a standard rate of $12 a trip for a patient, and just so that way everybody was on the same page. But when they turned it over to St. Joseph Hospital, they all signed an agreement in 1973 that they would stop as of January 1, 1974, and that's what they did. They were very limited, only providing transportation, possibly oxygen to the patient. But at that time, when the families did not want the flashing lights, or a mother wanted to be transported from the hospital back home after having a baby, or to the hospital, it usually was the funeral home that they called. So, any questions? Keep it simple. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. You can see a few more pictures. Atomo Fire apparently started an ambulance service during the 50s. And there were various fundraisers for various ambulances. And then in the 1970s, really what kind of kicked things off was when California passed a law about paramedics. And anybody remember Emergency? Yeah, great show. And Johnny and Roy showed us all how we could go about being great members of an EMS community. So, anybody ridden in an ambulance in here, other than those of you that have been providing service? Yeah. I'm told that it's kind of a bumpy ride. Is that pretty accurate? That and the people that I know that have ridden in the air ambulances generally don't remember that ride, so they don't have as much feedback. So let's go into our next phase, which is where we move from maybe just a transport service into something more that's being supported by hospitals. And we'll have Rich Gallmer come up and get us into the 70s and how we started a professional service.
Thank you. I was thinking when Bill was speaking that maybe when this was being organized, Will would come, because he's the only guy that's as old as I am. This stuff. I came to town in 1974, and at that time, and thanks to Tim for researching this, at that time in 1974, the fire department was providing some ambulance service. And the ambulance service that we had at that time was pretty good. It was better than the funeral homes, all due respect, but it was better than the funeral homes had. But these were firemen who were doing this work. And they weren't involved in any form of medical training or anything like that. I remember Hubert Smith was the fire chief at the time, and Hubert wanted out of the ambulance business. Partly the ambulance service would provide service to you if you lived in Atomo. And there were a couple of roads they'd go out, but if you lived in Agency or if you lived in Farson or Blakesburg or Eddyville or Eldon, you were kind of on your own. You called your neighbor maybe for ambulance service. So it evolved. Then maybe the county started taking it over. And throughout this history in the 70s until about 83, 84, 85, somewhere in there, this was like a volleyball match. It would go to the city. It'd go to the county. It'd go to the city and the county. And then when the ball went out of bounds, the hospitals got involved. And that was really kind of the history of the way it worked. The county had it, and it was housed at St. Joseph Hospital. The staff was in the old nurses' quarters there. And there became some personnel problems, and the county wanted out. And they wanted out badly. Badly enough said that we'll put some money in this if somebody else will take it. Well, the city didn't really want it, and the city said, we just don't have enough money to take care of it. So what can we do? Well, the St. Joe Hospital had a controller, a friend of mine named Jim Ragland, and he got the E911 go, so that you didn't call some number and hope they answered. I mean, that was kind of the emergency method that we had at the time. And so the E911 started going, and it's on your phone bill. That's how they collect it, and that's how they fund it. But then after the county had some money, and they would put in to support it and to underwrite it. And we had all sorts of fundraisers to raise ambulances, to buy ambulances. I remember the Oktoberfest, had an ambulance, and if you remember, it said Oktoberfest ambulance. I don't know if, anybody thought maybe there was gonna be beer inside or not. It was a thought. So eventually, when the city and the county wanted out, the hospitals came together. But the county was the one that was really underwriting. They had money through revenue sharing. That was a government program at the time. And they had that money available. And they were supporting the ambulance service, but they were hoping that there would be revenue from it to underwrite a portion of it. But it became very expensive. They were training people, and they wanted to train people to be both EMTs and paramedics. They wanted and the paramedics wanted to be paid appropriately, and they were picked up when they were county employees. They were members of the county union, and so there were some negotiations with regard to salary. And so the cost became more than the county wanted to do. And so the county said, we'll keep putting some money up to a certain limit. I think it was at $170,000 or $130,000, I don't recall exactly. But it would be run by the hospitals. And the county was very concerned about favoritism for the hospitals. Because at that time, we had two hospitals, Dunn Hospital and St. Joseph Hospital, and there was a committee. I was on the first committee that they had that. And we had to figure out, were we being fair if a person called and wanted an ambulance? If they were unconscious, we couldn't ask them where they wanted to go. So we had sort of a duty roster of where the people would go and so forth. Well, then, when Tunnel Hospital bought St. Joe, then the hospital said, with the support of the county, we will operate the ambulance service. That gets us to about 1984, 1985, when the hospital took it over. And it's been a challenge ever since. I think maybe if you guys remember, Bill, you remember, Tim, what Bill's last name was? Bill Birch. Bill Birch was he became the administrator of the hospital over in Memphis County, but he was here and he got it kind of organized. It's sort of, they outfitted it with the latest gear and equipment and so forth, and it became a challenge. And I know that I happen to be on the board at Indian Hills, and we've changed the EMT arrangement, so it's not a diploma arrangement anymore. You don't have to keep going to college a long time to get certified as an EMT. And that has, quite frankly, raised our enrollment there in the program. So we've really got good instructors. I think you're going to hear from them. But we've really got good instructors there, and it's being successful. So if there are questions, you heard? Oh, shoot. Okay, Keith?
Is Indian Hills involved in any way? Or could they be involved?
Well, I think the only way we would be involved, well, they should use this. The only way we'd be involved is training people. I think that's the only extent to which we would be involved. And I think, and we have trained a number of folks, but as far as financing it, I don't think we're authorized to do that. But we'll try to encourage young people to go into being an EMT or a paramedic. We desperately need healthcare workers in this community. And if we can get a few of them to start as EMTs, and I believe I see a person more knowledgeable than me back here. I believe we have a high school student who's taking we have two students who are high school students who are going through the EMT program.
Wow.
And, you know, maybe people don't stay in jobs as long as I did. That's,
No comment about
that's
that.
what we do. Thank you.
Thanks, Rich.
So I just want to highlight a couple of things. Rich talked a little bit about the monetary contributions. And you'll see that in 1978, the city and county were giving 170, or the budget was $170,000, and they were giving a quarter of that. And then eventually, Atumwa Hospital asked for a 3-year agreement and wanted some ambulances purchased as part of that. And kind of right before things got into Ormix or got going hot and heavy, the supervisors committed to $99,000 over 3 years. And the city indicated that they didn't have the funds. So they were, again, there's gonna be a theme throughout the evening, struggling to fund some of these services adequately. So, before we get to Cindy to talk about the Ormix era, who wants the best team giving top-notch care using the best technology? Do you think that's what we should have as a emergency medical service? I certainly do, and living in rural areas, we know that getting an immediate response and a quick response is important in situations like a heart attack or a stroke. And so if we don't have that level of service, it raises some serious questions. So let's get Cindy to talk about the Ormix era.
I guess.
I am a little bit older than just Ormix. Yes, Bill Reese, my first ambulance call was in a hearse with Bob Pedrick. And I was a student, and all there was in there was an oxygen tank and a barf pan. And we went to Iowa City one day with a 3-year-old that had diabetic ketoacidosis, was unresponsive. And I've told this story over and over. So we get there, the mom was riding with us in small town USA. I had no idea what I was doing, but I was in the class, right? The nurse tells me she gets car sick. So I'm thinking, okay, what's the big deal about that? So we get up there to Iowa City. The kid is unresponsive the whole time. And I'm thinking, what do you do with sick kids like this? They're unresponsive. I had no idea. We get up there, and Bob Pedrick says to the wife, now who's going to pick up your other kid from school today? And she says, oh, I hadn't even thought about that. And he goes, I'll call June. She'll go down and pick the kid up from school. Next thing you know, we get up there, we take the patient into the ER at the university, and he says, now, do you have any money with you today? She goes, oh, I didn't even think about that. You know, she's in a panic, the crying mom. He gets a $20 bill out of his billfold, and he says, here, you hang on to this until your husband gets up here tonight. That's what it's all about, folks. It's about taking care of people in their time of need and doing the right thing all the time. So I have to say that is the start of the old days, and I am fortunate to have worked in the best years of EMS. Because we came from that funeral home when there was nothing, and then we had technology, we had knowledge, we had all the best instructors around. You had the St. Joe ICU nurses being our mentors in the middle of the night when you had a chest pain. You had ER docs who wanted to teach you all the time. We had Indian Hills who came to all the communities who taught EMT classes. We really did have it good then. And then on top of that, then we got vehicles that were trustworthy, that would get you where you're going, and you could haul a couple of patients at a time. That was exciting. Then we got heart monitors, we got medications. Everything just escalated to you're running a mobile intensive care unit, and that's where it all started. So I have to make a little bit of fun here. That would be Bill Bruce. So this is the model that they started after Mary Greeley. Mary Greeley was the god of all EMS in the state. So this service was modeled after Mary Greeley. Bill Bruce started this with 7 paramedics, I believe, and 2 EMTs, and it grew from there. So many of those medics are still around, not all of them, but they had some war stories to tell, and it was definitely an adventure. When this talks about the thing about the ownerships of who's had what and when. So there was a lot of partnerships. We were truly making a system out of it countywide. As we figured out that we needed something or we didn't have the resources, then we would reach out to the other partners. Volunteers, we made EMS look good because we were in our local communities and everybody knew us and trusted us. And I always have to tell the story about Mike Holcomb. You know, little ladies are unresponsive. He walks in the door, the paramedics are like scurrying, wanting us to help them. And they're like, oh, Chief Mike is here. You know, all of a sudden she's alert and fine. So why did we call an ambulance for that? But she was unresponsive at one moment. So when you think about these kind of things over time, the local people carried it. You were proud of it. We were proud to be Ormix. We were proud to be EMS providers. We were proud to be volunteers and serve our community. And we knew our community and our community supported us. And that is probably one of the biggest things that you see in that volunteer environment. Now, those days are kind of gone by the wayside. Nobody's handing out a $20 bill or a $100 bill at a soup supper. So those things are hard to support anymore out in the community. And the tax funding is not there. And when I look at my taxes, you know, I don't have any kids in school. I'm paying Cardinal school taxes. I don't have any kids at Indian Hills, but I'm not there. Now, I did used to be an Indian Hills instructor, and I definitely love the programs out there, and I love being a teacher. But when we start thinking about these things, about where we get our blessings at, it's from being proud and making a strong community and doing the right thing every time. About who's paying for what, that's going to be an ongoing struggle all the way along, and we know that. Wrong direction?
Well, when you get that picture, which one's you in this?
I was in Keokuk County then, Don, the trauma capital of the world, where we made scene flights all the time there. That was back when I was young and foolish. Up there, we worked 12 days in a row, 24 hours a day. What does that tell you? What kids would do that these days? But we wanted to do it because we wanted to work there. Yeah. Better. Yes. So we talked about the surrendering ownership and authority. When we're building a system, many times we went back to this. We worked with the fire department. Why don't you do this and we could do that? The volunteers were more active than the paid services. It's went back and forth over time about who's interested in it. Who wants to do water rescue? Who wants to do grain bin rescue? Rescue is a big part of it. Who wants to go on the water tower? Anybody remember when they had the guy working on the water tower and he broke his femur up there? How do you get them out? Well, it just happened to be there's some of the guys that were interested in that kind of thing, and they did rope rescue. Probably not any OSHA approved activity that day. And they were calling Cargill, their partner, because they knew they had a high angle rope rescue team. So you got to think about those things. If that was your family, wouldn't you want an ambulance coming to that? Wouldn't you want good training, good equipment? Wouldn't you cough up some money for that? What is the cost for somebody's life? And I'm going to say that over and over. So we talked about 7-year agreements. I told Tim probably the other person we should have invited here was Melody Lowe. Melody has helped done this history time after time with this. Probably worked with Rich a lot. But when we talk about who's paying half and who's paying little, I remember the one year we did Dare to Dream. Some of you may have come to that. That was after Bridgeview was here, and we raised money that year, and it bought us one ambulance that basically had no bells and whistles in it. So when you start thinking about what an ambulance costs today, nobody bats an eye at these $1 million fire trucks. But what about something that's going to haul you and save your life? Property or life? Oh, wait, here we go. I'll have to get on my fire EMS thing right now. So this is when they were asking for money. When they started with am I still on the wrong way? Reagan. That was where we're starting.
There you go.
I can't read it here, Tim, I'm old.
Go ahead and answer. That's it.
So in 1994, there was a couple of gals here, Lori Reeves and Benita, used to be Benita Klein, did a lot of work, and they went out and they did all of our quality things that we were working on. And we were EMS Service of the Year that year in Iowa and nationally. Now, I would say that's a pretty big deal. We didn't really know it was a pretty big deal at the time. We just thought they were doing the work, but we really did have a quality ambulance service then and close working relationship with our providers. The Chillicothe first responders, you know, as you recruit, as it grows, there's more interest. We got those going. Every one of our communities had first responders. And then Tim was, he's always kind of been into politics a little bit, in case you guys didn't know. He's always looking for a funding source to work on his projects. He can find money anywhere that there's money around. The one great one that he has done is helping them with the EMT students. That's a great project that we just did in the last couple of years. So that's bringing it back to our community again. Duck races. Anybody ever go to those duck races? Yeah. The first year was a little red car, a little convertible that Jan won that year. But that was a big deal. We spent a lot of work and raised a lot of money. Everybody was buying ducks. Let's see, city and county, 24. I think probably that was, back in that era, 24 was about the cap of the staff we had. To make us, we were running 2 to 3 trucks at a time. We could pull in an extra crew to run an out-of-town transfer. Back in that era, it was all about out-of-town trips made our money because you got to charge for mileage. But then it's always the time when you can't draw any money out of it. So that back in that era, and I think Mark's probably got some numbers here for more recent, but like it was 65% Medicare, 19% Medicaid back then, and 8% private pay. So when you look at that, and then somebody wants to go to Mayo, and it wouldn't pay for that trip because it only paid at the closest appropriate facility. So we had a lot of things like that that we learned to deal with. We didn't have any idea about it. We were trying to provide a quality service. And then there's somebody downstairs balancing the budget. That was also back in the era when we learned we had to rotate our trucks to keep them running because it'll nickel and dime you, and then $1,000 at a time, and you can't let them ride. Because if you let them till they run and they're turned to junk, that's when you're taking a critical patient to Iowa City and you're on the side of the road. Nobody wants to see their billboard on the side of the road with a wrecker. Darren, it was on a first name basis. A Temple Fire had an interest then. They got a different fire chief. He was interested in AEDs and what we could do with that because they could see weren't going on calls. They were going on calls. Before that, the PD was going on calls. They didn't like going on calls. But everybody was there. So I have to say that the sheriff's office, the police department, the fire service, all those people always came to take care of patients because they were trying to do the right thing at the time. They were not doing it because there was city funding. They were not doing it because there was a political turf about whose barrier it is, but they were doing it because people needed help. Our county association tried many times to work on EMD. Brenda Bennett, y'all know she's retired now, but that was Brenda and I's dream, that we would have EMD so we could have pre-arrival instructions so people could be triaged out or given the best care they need. That didn't happen. Eddyville Fire had to relinquish their license at one point. When you get a cease and desist from the state, you probably know you didn't do the right thing. So if you were a fireman and you loaded a patient in an ambulance and you were headed down the road and both of the people are in the front for a guy who's just hit a bridge abutment. Yeah, that was kind of a big deal that year. So when you're gonna run a service, you gotta do it right. The system standards, we worked on them a lot. We came a long way with them. We had many successes with it, and it really brought us together as a group. So I think that was huge. Public health. Public health has changed over time, just like everything else, and adapted. When I was back out in Indian Hills, we talked a lot about the whole thing with what would be the scope of practice of a paramedic. Now you're seeing that all the hospitals and ERs want to hire paramedics too. Clinics want to get anybody with medical training. But back in that day, it was very defined that public health and EMS could not cross paths because we were doing their work. So that was starting to take over in every place else. And it took a while to get up here to Iowa. Anybody in here ever saved a life? Yeah, it makes a difference if you're somebody who saved a life. Anybody ever watch somebody die right in front of you? Because they didn't have what they needed? Yeah. So I'm probably preaching to the choir in this group about what's the right thing to do and what we need to have locally. And there's a million war stories that you could talk to anybody here about. But I am very proud to have worked at EMS up here for all of these years since 1978, when I took my first EMT class when Mark was only 4. But yeah, and I hope I can still do it until I can no longer do it, because I think it's a big deal. And I encourage all these students, I still love to have students around. They are the motivation for what we're doing. And if we can give them that passion that you have to have for EMS, because you can't, it's not for the faint of heart. And it's a hard job some days. But I'm very proud of this service and hope you guys support us.
Thank you very much. And now we're gonna transition to what the current state of our ambulance service is here in Wapello County with Mark Freimuller.
See if I can get this to work correctly. So in 2020, obviously, the COVID pandemic hit. Also, we had the Great Resignation or the Great Retirement. We lost a lot of people from the baby boomers and had a dramatic effect on work forces all across all sectors. In 2022, the Indian Health Advisory Council, this is what Cindy talked to a little bit, was looking at very low enrollments. 3 MPs and 4 paramedics to discuss the need to do more outreach to recruit students. That's when they developed the Wapello County EMS, or it's when they developed the paid internship program where they were paying high school students and students up to the age of 24 to attend an EMT class. Generated a lot of EMTs. I know both Tumble Fire and Ormix have both hired several, so of the surrounding counties. The EMS Association revisited system standards, providing data to Service Area 5 Healthcare Coalition. The advisory committee discussed again how to get EMS education into the high schools and early recruitment, and discussion between the hospital and the city and county officials about support. No definitive action was taken at that time. In 2023, a letter to the community from CEO at the time, William Kiefer, was co-signed by community leaders explaining moving Ormix from full paramedic authorization to a conditional authorization. Cindy said, back in when it was really at its top, we had 24 full-time paramedics. You couldn't hardly get hired at Ormix without being a full-time paramedic. Now, the decrease in paramedics has made that ratio go about 50-50 between paramedics and EMTs. Wapello County EMA in partnerships with Van Buren County Hospital, Davis County Hospital, Centerville Fire and Rescue, and Indian Hills Community College launched the 4-county partnership for a summer youth EMT internship program. That program has now in its 3rd year, and has, I don't remember the numbers on how many it's graduated, but we have seen that increase the number of EMS providers in all the surrounding counties. The advisory committee recommended changes in the EMS program. I think we talked about that a little bit. The paramedic program is not a full degree program. It's not a 4-credit program now. It is a certification program, and there are currently, I believe, 15 people enrolled in that program. So we went from seeing 2 to 4 people enrolled in a paramedic program to 15 enrolled in that program. EMA presents EMS's Essential Service Resolution to the Board of Supervisors on behalf of the Wapello County EMS Association, representing all EMS services. And that's kind of what's brought us to where we are today in this meeting today. The Board of Supervisors, again, as Tim mentioned, revisited the topic of EMS. EMA presents EMS Essential Services process to the Board of Supervisors, meets with local officials and stakeholders, reviews the draft of the advisory council list as recommended by the Board of Supervisors, and then we began the work we're doing today to inform everybody of this process.
And I don't think that, this question is one that, any of us wants to answer, but, this emergency medical services is a vital part of saving human lives. And as we look at, chapter 422D, you've heard a little bit of discussion about advisory councils and resolutions. And that law has a very specific process to get you through to a discussion about the funding. And you have to have the Board of Supervisors pass a resolution. And we got that in Wapello County. The next step of that process is the advisory council. And so we're gonna invite Tim up to talk a little bit about the advisory council and how it's formed and what it's like. And then we'll get into a little bit more, with the Board of Supervisors.
So the assessment for our needs is the real work, and what we've been doing the last 4 months is just setting the stage for that work to be done. And the advisory council is the group of people that's gonna do that. There's a large misconception, because I'm the spokesperson, that I am wanting to run the ambulance service, or the EMA is running around the ambulance service, and that could be farther from the truth. I'm not crazy. I know how hard it is. I'm simply the spokesperson for the process, and that's it. So the EMS Association that many of us have been part of for a long time, they got started in 1988, largely over the years has focused on things like what are our best practices, being congruent in processes, spending grant money, doing training, putting on training, all those kinds of collaborative things. And then when the system standards came along in 2010, we embraced that process. And that's something we still continue to work on today, because we're trying to better EMS as a state. And that's what our state guidance folks in EMS give us as a rubric. So what are the tasks of the EMS Advisory Council? And they're right there before you. They're going to survey, analyze, and report on the performance of our system in Wapello County. They're going to evaluate the structure, the process, and the outcome of our EMS events, which are your calls for service. They're going to look at the adequacy of system funding, which I think we know that answer. The appropriate resource utilization. We're going to look at reducing that burden on volunteers. Not that volunteers aren't important, but you've heard tonight how that world has changed. And how do we integrate EMS into the existing healthcare system? No service stands alone. We're all integrated in how we deliver care for patients. And the fact that we're losing providers in rural Iowa, and so across the board. And then we'll look at continuing education and training requirements to meet those certification requirements. And you heard a few things that we're doing to try and address those needs. So what is it our community asks us to do? What are the kinds of calls that we're answering? So here's some data from last year. Countywide, just over 5,000 calls for emergency medical services. And so here's your breakdown of the different modalities. So 64% of that's medical, 20% of that is trauma. There's some psych issues that has risen over the years. Lymphocysts, there's some different reasons for lymphocysts. There's people that want to try to stay home, as we all probably do as we age, but there's less and less resources to help some of those folks out. And there's a lot of transfers between hospital to hospital. And some of that's because we need to get into higher level definitive care. And some of it's we don't have the providers maybe we once had in our community. And so we see that. And one of the things we saw during COVID was a shortage of beds. You heard that shortage of beds. Well, there's plenty of beds, just not enough staff to staff those beds. And some of that hasn't really improved since 2020. And that's true even in the large cities. If you talk to Des Moines hospitals and Iowa City hospitals, they're still having that struggle. And that has been true since COVID. That has not changed. So that puts increasing demand on our EMS system to figure out where do we get those patients to. One of the evening collaborative meetings I was in our region, Service Area 5 healthcare region, which is 20 plus counties, is there was one facility that had to go as far as Omaha to get a patient placed, and that's not terribly uncommon. So a little bit about the system standards. I won't get too deep into it, but here are the standards we saw earlier, along with some of the gaps that we've identified in some of this assessment work. And we look at the system standard rubric every year to identify gaps and see what opportunities are up to improve. And then we pick a few things to work on intently that year. And I was told that because we had 3 things we picked this year, we were a pretty aggressive group. So we'll take that as a compliment, I guess. We don't have a true countywide system that has centralized management and we are consistent in our efforts and expectations across the board. You've heard us talk about staffing and training, those two are tied together. But we're working on recruitment, we're working with our partners, with the college, with the hospital, with non-transport EMS, the fire service, they're all doing their part to turn that ship around. I think we are having some success there. Communications is something we've wanted to do something with for many years, and that too costs money and staffing to do emergency medical dispatch. And as you learned in the historical conversation, ambulances are always an Achilles heel. Just because we got rid of the horses doesn't get rid of the problems. And anything with a motor has an issue. And these are used in the roughest, most severe of consequences in time. So they're high mileage vehicles with a lot of pressure around, and they're very expensive. Data collection is something that we've been working on as an EMS association for the last several months. Just making sure that we're collecting data in the same way and being consistent about it, because that data is what we're going to use to make some decisions. And then we've also had a conversation in relationship to data, and that we don't share that data like we should. We should be putting that out there better to the public so that you understand these things. Some of this information you probably haven't heard before tonight, and that's a disservice, that's a failure on our part. So we need to get better at that, having that annual conversation and report. And then disaster medical response, which disaster is my world, is EMA. If we don't have adequate resources every day of the week, what are we gonna have when the big thing happens? And so that's why the work every day to shore up what's every day also transcends into the bigger events. So what does EMS cost? And we're gonna talk about numbers. We're gonna talk about what goes into an EMS service. And there's really 2 different parts of that conversation, which is really true for any emergency service. The sheriff could tell you the same thing for him, the police department, the fire department. There's a cost to just having the staff, equipment, training, all that ready and able to respond. And then there's the cost to actually respond and meeting those needs and those demands. And as the history timeline shows you, the 2 pain points are always personnel and equipment. Cindy talked about this a little bit. This is what our payer mix looks like currently. So when you have that high of a percentage of folks that reliant on support from publicly funded programs like Medicaid and Medicare, there's very low reimbursement percentages for those services. And so that makes it a real struggle to operate these services.
So, transition, have we ever been in a car accident? I'm a victim of that several times over. Anybody else that had an ambulance called when they've been in a car wreck? And they respond to practically everyone, and in order to do that, they have to be there. So, our next speaker is the Board of Supervisors, and I'm not sure how much detail Brian's going to get into, but 422D puts this conversation squarely in the hands of the Wapello County Board of Supervisors. So they've gone through that process of passing a resolution. Now they're in the process of getting that advisory council up and running, and I think Brian's going to be able to talk to you about that process and where you are in it and what that entails.
Yes, and thank you, Gayla. I so appreciate everybody's attendance here. It's just like everybody that needs to be here is here this evening. That is so neat. And I want to thank so many of you because you've been providing these kinds of services for years. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Well, even before I was a supervisor, and I still am, I'm trained to EMR, and I'm on the Wapello County Fire Department, been on that department for 37 years now. And so from that experience, I've learned a lot about this topic. And then I find now that I am a supervisor, I have a little additional responsibility that I can exercise, and I'm willing to do that. And I'm so appreciate the support that I have from the other two supervisors, both Darren and Carrie. We have been working together on this. It's a good team. I'm so pleased with how this is progressing for us and our ability to work with the county. So our process is based on the Iowa Code 422D. I'll have to admit, I'm not a fan of Iowa Code usually. I've found that I have to pay attention to it a lot lately. But Iowa Code 422D does lay out a good process to implement this. And it's a process that allows us as a county to take control of it locally. I like that. I like the idea of the state's not telling us how to do this, the federal government's not telling us how to do this. We can design a system that is for us. That is a neat thing. So our process is this. We started in January discussing it. We ended up with a resolution on the agenda on February 1st, and that opened the window of the 60-day notice. And then we began the process of reading the resolution, which was April 8th, April 22nd. We have one more reading to go, and that'll be May 6th. It's been approved twice. I anticipate the third one will be approved. Next step then on May 6th is to appoint the advisory council. And then that council during the spring and summer will begin to do their studying and recommendations. And then they'll present that to the Board of Supervisors in the fall. I hope it happens before the fall. Tim, make sure it happens before fall, okay? And then we can present it to the voters. In the end, the voters get to decide this. And I think that's always a beautiful thing for our democracy when citizens can make the decisions for themselves in this process. And we have this information ready for you. The fact that you are here means that you are part of the process, and we want you to participate, and we really welcome and encourage that. I myself have a vision for how this should look. I'm not going to share that tonight. I actually want to wait to see what the advisory council comes up with. But I have a vision for how this should look, and I'm going to be very involved in the process of making sure something good happens for us in this county.
And I just want to do a little bit of wrap up. I'm not sure that we're in a position to really talk questions at this point. I think this is designed to create a lot of conversation and have people seek information. Just by way of background, 19 counties in Iowa have identified emergency medical services as an essential service, which means that those 19 counties have adopted ways to fund emergency medical services. Each county can make their own decision. And I think some of the things that are really important in the law that is out there is it has to be designed just to fund those services, nothing else. So as the Wapello County Board of Supervisors looks at this issue and tries to determine if they're going to go to some sort of public vote on a levy, they can look only at what would fund this service, and it can only be used for those purposes. That includes payroll, ambulances, those things that we've talked about, that there are the pinch points for providing quality emergency medical services. So we're thrilled that you're here, that you have shown an interest in learning about essential service designation for emergency medical services. And I encourage you to check out the website, to listen as the County Board of Supervisors takes that last step on May 6th and potentially identifies this as an essential service, and then provide your feedback to the advisory council as they help the Board of Supervisors figure out the next step. Yeah.
I have a couple questions actually. So my first question is, if we did do this EMS, as an essential service. Does that mean that Ormix would still have the ambulance service and we would just do funding, or does that mean the county would take over the ambulance service?
That will be something that the advisory council will make recommendations to the board of supervisors about what a structure looks like and how it gets funded.
So my second question, so I'm kind of ignorant about this. What's the difference between an EMT and paramedic? And how many people do you have to have in an ambulance at a time? And can we attract those people, say salary ones?
So an EMT does a basic level of care. A paramedic can do more invasive care. They can do IVs, intubations, more medications. So, and obviously they have a lot more training to go along with it. So yes, I believe we can attract those people, but I think we have to get back into people wanting to go into those lines of work. I think with COVID and that era, I think we've seen a lot of people not getting into the healthcare field. I think we're hopefully seeing that pendulum swing back the other way. But yes, I believe we can attract them here.
So you would have to have two people in the ambulance at a time, obviously a driver,
Yeah.
and then another person. Does that person have to be a paramedic or can they be an EMT?
They can be an EMT, they can be an EMT and a paramedic, it can be two EMTs. We prefer to have a minimum of an EMT and a paramedic.
And I think it's good to recognize that Indian Hills made some changes to their program to really encourage some more involvement.
With the hopscotch pattern of development for EMS for Wapello County over the years, is there data available on the cost from each of the different sources and the metrics or the numbers of services provided?
And I'll let Tim address that. I think I know the answer.
Again, that's what the advisory council will be looking at and collecting that data and talking with fellow counties and other services and rest and all that. They've started that initially, but absolutely that's the role of the advisory council. Because there are many options. I think Lori asked a question that's on everybody's mind, and I think everybody just wants to know what the end goal, what the end solution is, but there's a process to lay out those options and figure out what is the best, because there's multiple ways to do it, and then we've done it multiple ways. So what is the best way? And that's what the advisory council do.
So of those 19 counties that have adopted this, how many of those does the county run the ambulance service?
I don't know that answer. I have the data on what percentage of the vote and how much they did, but I didn't collect that data. So, and the website will be up in about a week. It's still under construction, but we'll put all the background documents that we've shared with the board and all this data too, and continue to add stuff so that people have access to it. And we may have a link in there where people can email in questions too.
I mean, I absolutely think it's an essential service, and I would absolutely vote for it. I just was wondering, how much of it is the county involvement, and how much of it would you put, say, to Ormix? And if the county did take it over, what does that do to Ormix?
All questions that will be wrestled with the council. We're gonna give them that task to figure out. At the end of the day, we want a reliable, quality service that is sustainable, and we need to balance that with our current taxation demands and all the changes in the taxation environment right now.
So I'm just wondering, so before the recommendations are presented to the county, will the community have another opportunity to hear of those recommendations prior? And not just like in a report, but in a presentation like this, so comments, concerns, praises can be addressed?
Yeah, we can absolutely do that. Yeah, not opposed to that whatsoever. And I'm seeing the nods of the supervisor, so I think I can count on that happening.
Perfect. I just hear a lot of questions that aren't going to be able to be answered tonight. I mean, I have some questions I can't ask tonight either. And so it would be really, I think, beneficial to everyone to be able to be part of those conversations before they're presented to the supervisors.
Absolutely. And I think what you'll see is regular reports in front of the board of supervisors from the advisory council about where they're at, what that conversation is, and ample opportunity for that input.
Perfect.
I'd like to know what's the makeup of the advisory council going to be? I mean, who are the representatives? It doesn't necessarily have to be the people, but what's the breakdown? Is it, between county, urban, rural, so on and so forth?
And I don't know that that's actually been determined. That's something that the Board of Supervisors will take up on May 6th. I don't know if there's,
So We did give initial lists early on, but it has changed a little bit. So, just, and trying to recite from memory, but the core of it's gonna be our EMS service directors. So those that are running EMS services now, they're the subject matter experts, and they represent the cross-section of the county and all the cities. We'll also have our medical director who was here, and I think he had to leave to go to shift, Dr. Lissy. We've asked a retired physician, to be part of it, and, one of the member board of supervisors, one member from the Autumnal Council, as a core group, and then we'll also have a list of ad hoc members from other parts of the healthcare system that we'll pull in when we're having relevant conversations that involve them. So I think your core group is like 7 or 8, and the whole council in its entirety is 14, and I think that's a manageable number. If we assign somebody to every single role that the state recommended, we'd have a group of 32 people, and that's just, you simply can't do anything efficient with that.
Understood, but when you say EMS, that goes back to what you said, we're the providers at the beginning, so it's not only those running as medical services, but those providing medical services through fire services as well.
Yeah, so there's, I believe, 7 of those. Yeah, those EMS service directors, most of them are fire-based, and ORMICs, and so they're the ones doing it every day. They know the demands of EMS, they know how it works, they know, and so they've been involved all along in that EMS association group, and so they've been tackling data questions and working to prepare for this, and I told them all along from the beginning, they would be the core that we would just add to them. And so there's still gonna be an EMS association that works on things like grants and training and those kind of things, but the council has a specific task, and you saw what their charge was to figure out.
Perfect.
Paul went ahead and asked the question. I was gonna ask, what was the composition of the EMS advisory council gonna look like?
Any other general questions? You know, at this point, it's the process is getting started, and so the recognition of emergency medical services as an essential service in Wapello County is the big step that happens May 6th. And then we get to work trying to figure out what that looks like going forward and how we fund it. So, yeah.
This lady has a question. Yeah, before you get, this is all gonna be planned, and it's gonna come out of our taxes. But are we gonna be able to know where that money's going, and who is gonna be running it, and who is gonna be taking care of the money?
And
Before we vote.
And the answer to that is yes. One of the things that the law requires is that when the Board of Supervisors puts a ballot initiative out there, they have to describe in that ballot initiative what that money is gonna be used for and why they think the amount is whatever X number of dollars it is. They cannot seek funds that are in excess of what the advisory council indicates, and the advisory council will continue to work after a levy is passed and evaluate whether that is an appropriate number. There is a cap under state law on what the levy can be on a property tax side of things. You can also have a local income tax, and the Board of Supervisors will have to evaluate where that budget is and which one of those tools they want to take, or if it's a combination that they want to take to the voters, and they have to explain on the ballot initiative exactly what their thinking is.
Okay, one other question. So the surtax and the levy both would have to be voted on, correct? Like which route it would go, correct?
Any tax would have to be voted upon.
So if the levy is established, then does it have to be voted on again to be raised or lowered? And I would say no, because that's in this, like in our levies, they don't, they have to, so just confirming.
I can't speak to that 100%, but like I said, there is a cap on what the property tax side is. There is not, I don't think, a cap on what a local income tax would be. 1%. Okay.
What it'll come down to is the language on the ballot. If the ballot says, I believe the EMS levy is up to 75 cents, right? So you write on the ballot language says, will you approve the EMS levy up to 75 cents? So then at that point, you can have it 5 cents, you can have it 75 cents.
Right, you can't go over 75 cents per thousand.
Majority of the counties are at 75.
Yeah. There are very few that have a local income tax. There are some, but many of them are at 75 cents per thousand. Yes.
These students that Indian Hills trains, how many of them have been retained in the county as medics?
Mark, Jennifer's got
So so right now, our current, paramedic class is 15, and all the work, are, from somewhere within the area, not just Wapello County, but somewhere within our service area. So we do have some from, Van Buren, Davis, and so forth, but there is, Mark might know how many he has that he sponsors for.
He has 5.
Five, okay. So, from
Is
one.
there gonna be an incentive to keep these people in the county? Through this advisory board?
So I think incentivization, a lot, happens through employers. And so, that, through employers, so, a lot of times that's how, incentives happen. And most of our employers that we are working with do have incentives attached.
And it's not uncommon to see individuals working for multiple services and even in multiple counties.
Yes.
It's not uncommon to see an individual with these skills work in multiple services or even in multiple counties. That's very common.
And most of the ones in the program are there on tuition from the employer that has a commitment to stay with the employer for a period of time as well.
I think what I was going here is the tax break on the property taxes.
What?
How about giving the tax break on the property taxes?
Actually, that's been introduced in legislature for volunteers,
Yeah.
just this session.
Yep.
That's been proposed in legislation, but just, I don't think it makes, it definitely gets brought up every year in the legislature. So, I'm sorry.
That would be a legislative, issue.
Kind of a follow-up question about the incentives, is there any sort of a mandate built into the program that they commit to working locally for a period of time?
So that again is through the employers that are providing those incentives. That's not through our program, we can't hold them to that because we're not the employer.
That's where.
But the employers have, and that's what Mark was referring to, is that the employer has paid some of the tuition, and then they work with their internal on those deals.
All right, it looks like we have no further questions. So I'm really thrilled that you came out tonight and joined us for this conversation. Keep your eyes posted. Come to the supervisors meeting on May 6th, and then contribute to the conversation. So if they schedule another one of these public meetings, we'd be happy to see you again and provide the work of the advisory council. So thanks again, and be safe driving home. We want to use emergency services.